There's a sound in the void, a heartbeat. It is not your own. You feel in the fillings of your teeth, in the cold marrow of your bones, a deep and steady thrum that is the only proof you are still alive, still moving to the absolute nothing between the stars. You are a passenger on a pilgrimage, a soul in transit across an ocean of madness, cradled within a vessel of iron and faith. Your destination is Holy Terra. Your purpose is devotion. Your reality is a tiny, fragile bubble of stale air and recycled prayers, hurtling through a universe that despises you. You know the stories. Of course. You know the dangers that wait in the Immaterium, the demons that thirst for the warmth of your soul. You brace for monsters. You pray for strength against horrors. But the true terror of the warp is not what it shows you to beyond. It is what it shows you of yourself, of what you were, and what you, in your fervor, have allowed to be forgotten. If this journey into the darkest corners of our own past resonates with you, if you believe these stories must be heard, then add your voice to the choir. Like this video, share it with those who must see, and subscribe to the channel. Together, we keep the vigil. The world shrank to the sound of a single, pounding heart. Yvain felt it through the deck, grating beneath her thin-soled boots, a deep, subsonic throb that was the only constant in her universe. It was a beat of the St. Andronicus's plasma core, the great mechanical heart that pushed the pilgrim ship through the void. Around her, in the vaulted chamber of the common decks, 10,000 other hearts beat in frantic, whispered counterpoint. The air was a thick soup of recycled oxygen, smelling of stale incense, ozone from overworked air scrubbers, and the sharp, animal scent of human fear. The lumens set into groin ceiling flickered, their light a pale, sickly yellow that did little to push back the shadows pooling in the stone-carved alcoves of the Imperial saints. They were embarking on the long, silent swim. The translation was imminent. Yvain kept her head down, her stylus moving automatically across the data slate balanced on her knees. Her task was to record the devotional numbers. How many souls attended the pre-translation chant? The volume of the collective prayer, as measured by the brass sound analyzers mounted on the pillars. It was meaningless work, a tiny cog in the vast bureaucratic engine of the pilgrimage, but it gave her a reason to watch, to listen. She saw the pilgrims packed shoulder to shoulder, their faces drawn upwards toward the pulpit where a red-robed preacher spun tales of demons with teeth of fire and claws of broken faith. His voice was a lash, meant to drive them into fervor. Most complied, their mouths moving in silent, terrified prayer. Some, like the old man beside her, simply wept, tears cutting clean tracks through the grime on his cheeks. Yvain felt nothing but a hollow, familiar ache. She had made 3 warp transits before. The fear never changed, but her capacity to share in collective panic had worn thin, replaced by a cold, observational curiosity. What were they all so afraid of, really? The unknown? Or was it the quiet, lingering shame of what they were leaving behind? A deep, shuddering groan echoed to the ship's spine, a sound of metal stressed to its absolute limit. The lumens dimmed, then flared bright for one shocking second before settling into a lower, emergency-grade glow. The preacher's voice cut off. The only sound was the relentless thrum-thrum-thrum of the plasma heart. Then a new layer of silence descended, a profound, absolute quiet that was felt more than heard. The Geller field had engaged. Reality was now a bubble, a fragile eggshell of reason protecting them from the infinite madness outside the hull. The sense of pressure was immense, a physical weight on the chest. Yvain's data slate chimed softly, the numbers on her screen plunging to 0. The Astronomican's guiding light, that psychic lighthouse of the Emperor, was gone. They were on their own, in the dark. From the ship's choir loft high above, a single, pure voice began a litany of safe passage. One by one, 1,000 other voices joined, weaving a complex, haunting harmony meant to fortify the soul. The choir of the lost and found, they were called. Their song was beautiful, and it filled Yvain with a deeper dread than any silence could. For the next 6 standard cycles, time lost all meaning. It became measured in rituals. The change of the watch, the hour of penitent reflection, the distribution of nutrient paste. The ship was a sealed world, a floating city of devotion and deprivation. Yvain's tiny berth was a curtained-off alcove in the scribe's warren, a space barely large enough for her pallet, and a locked trunk containing her few personal effects: a spare robe, a vial of cheap ink, and a single illegal curiosity, a crudely carved wooden bird from a world she could no longer name. The air was never still, constantly cycled by groaning vents, but always carried the same taste: flat, metallic, and faintly sour with the breath of thousands. She moved through her duties like an automaton, updating passenger manifests, logging piety marks awarded for exceptional devotion, becoming an invisible part of the ship's administrative bloodstream. Her only reprieve was her assigned walk to the secondary observation blister, a duty given to low-tier scribes because no one else wanted it. It was a long, lonely trek down deserted access corridors, lined with dripping condensation pipes. The blister itself was a bubble of reinforced plex mounted on the ship's underbelly, offering a view not of stars, but of the swirling, impossible colors of the warp. Most scribes hurried in, stamped a manual log to prove they'd checked the hull integrity seals, and hurried out, unable to bear the sight. Yvain lingered. She would press her palm against the cold plex and watch the Imperium rage silently beyond. There were no demons, not that she could see. Only vast, nebulous shapes of light and shadow that pulsed with strange, terrible sentience. It was in these moments of quiet, staring into the face of the unreal, that she felt most grounded. The horror outside was honest. It was pure. It was a simpler thing than the quiet, complex horrors of the ship's own society. Back in the common areas, those horrors were on subtle display. A hierarchy had solidified, brutal in its simplicity. At the top were the ecclesiarchy personnel, the preachers and confessors who move with air of divine authority. Then came the ship's security, their flak armor scrubbed clean, their shock mauls hanging with menacing promise. Then the crew, ratings engineers, men and women smeared with promethium grease who kept the heart beating. And at the very bottom, the vast, teeming mass of pilgrims themselves, stratified further by wealth and origin world. Arguments over queue positions for the sanctified food dispensers could turn violent. A rumor of a possessed stowaway had seen a man from the feral world of coffees dragged away by security, his screams echoing for an hour. Yvain documented it all, her stylus capturing the friction points in dry, administrative glyphs. She saw how fear curdled into cruelty, how faith twisted into a cudgel. The warp outside was a passive threat. The real pressure, the grinding daily terror, was being generated within the Geller field by the very souls it was meant to protect. On the 9th cycle, the first irregularity occurred. Yvain was in her alcove, attempting to recalibrate a flickering lumen globe, when the sound reached her. It was the choir, halfway through the canticle of warding. The harmony was a complex, living thing, a tapestry of sound. And then a single thread snapped, a mezzo-soprano part, a steady, sustaining note in the third movement, simply vanished. It wasn't a voice cracking or fading. It was as if it had never been there at all. The remaining voices faltered for a fraction of a second, the harmony turning thin and discordant before recovering. A cold finger traced its way down Yvain's spine. It was a tiny thing, a hiccup in the daily ritual. But on a ship, sailing the Sea of Souls, ritual was everything. Ritual was the wall. And a single brick had just silently disappeared. She expected alarm. She expected a voice over the ship-wide vox to announce a technical fault, or for a confessor to immediately launch into a sermon about renewed focus. There was nothing. The choir finished the canticle. The lumens burned at their same low level. The plasma heart thrummed on. The silence that followed the missing note was more deafening than any noise. Yvain left her alcove and moved into the wider scribe's warren. The other scribes, a dozen men and women of various ages, were bent over their own slates, their faces illuminated in the ghostly blue glow. No one looked up. No one mentioned it. Had she imagined it? The doubt was a worm in her mind. She approached Senior Scribe Holton, a man whose face was a map of deep lines and deeper disapproval, his robe permanently stained with ink. Senior Scribe, she began, her voice low. During the canticle, the third movement, did you note an auditory anomaly? Holton didn't look up from his work, a dense ledger of tithe estimations. The choir's fidelity is not within your purview. Scribe Yvain, Your purview is a log of consumable piety markers. You are behind. Attend to your purview. It was a dismissal as solid and cold as a bulkhead door. She returned to her station, but the worm of doubt had teeth now. It wasn't just about the note. It was about the reaction, the lack of one. On a vessel where a misspoken prayer could earn you a lashing, a flaw in the primary devotional shield should have caused uproar. Instead, there was this administrative silence. She pulled up the ship's internal audit logs, a system she was technically authorized to access for cross-referencing resource allocation with devotional attendance. It was a mountain of mundane data. Promethium flow rates, water reclamation percentages, oxygen exchange metrics. She filtered for the exact timestamp of the choir's anomaly. Most systems showed no change. But one line item, buried in the automated environmental management feed, blinked. At that precise moment, a minor cargo airlock on Deck Theta 7 had cycled. Designation: Cargo Pod Theta 77. Status: jettisoned. Reason: atmospheric scrubber particulate saturated. Mass: 0.75 tons. Yvain stared at the line. Jettisoning waste was routine. The warp's contamination contained even refuse, making disposal into the Immaterium a necessary sanitation step. But the mass, she cross-referenced. A standard load of saturated scrubber particulate, a foul gel of condensed impurities, had a mass of roughly 0.1 tons. 0.75 was too high. It was a significant discrepancy, hidden in a sea of normalcy, and it had happened at the exact second the choir's voice had vanished. Coincidence was a luxury the Imperium could not afford. It was the first thread, and she had pulled it. Now, the entire tapestry seemed to shiver. The thread let her down. Deck Theta 7 was a secondary cargo level, far from the pilgrim decks, a realm of grinding machinery and the constant, damp heat of the ship's internal processing systems. The air here tasted of rust and hot oil, a welcome change in the recycled staleness above. The corridors were narrow, lit by failing lumens that buzzed like angry insects, their light casting long, dancing shadows from the snaking pipework overhead. Yvain's scribe robes, marked with the sigil of the Administratum, were her only shield. Crew ratings and grubby coveralls gave her wide berth, their eyes downcast. The authority of the quill was abstract, but it was still authority. She followed the designation stenciled on the bulkheads in fading white paint, the numbers leading her deeper into the ship's industrial gut. She found the airlock, Cargo Port Theta 77. It was a featureless, circular hatch set into wall, surrounded by a warning band of hazard yellow paint. A single, green rune on a small control panel indicated it was sealed and dormant. There was nothing to see. No evidence, no clue. It was just a door that had opened and closed. Yet, standing before it, Yvain felt a profound chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. The hum of the plasma heart was muffled here, replaced by the gurgle of fluid processors and the hiss of steam. She imagined a hatch cycling open, the silent, airless void of the warp beyond, the pod being ejected into that sea of madness. What had it carried? Not scrubber waste. Something with mass. Something that, when it left, had caused a voice in the choir to cease. Her investigation hit a wall harder than the adamantine bulkhead. The cargo manifest for Pod Theta 77 was locked behind a clearance cipher she did not possess. Her inquiries to the low-level logisticy servitors were met with gurgled binary negative chirps. The deck foreman, a burly woman with a permanent scowl and hydraulic graphs on one arm, simply pointed a greasy finger back the way Yvain had come. Scribe business is above. My business is below. You are in my business. Leave. The message was clear. The ship's lower decks operated on a different set of rules, a quiet understanding that certain questions were not asked. The silence was not just administrative. It was cultural, woven into the very fabric of the St. Andronicus. Frustration was a bitter taste in her mouth. She retreated to the upper decks, to the familiar, oppressive atmosphere of prayer and fear. The missing voice in the choir was not replaced. The harmony had simply been rearranged, the other voices shifting to fill the gap, a seamless, horrifying adjustment. Life went on. Pilgrims wept and prayed. Security patrols marched with grim purpose. The preachers thundered about purity and the perils of the warp. Yvain performed her duties, but her mind was a locked vault, turning over the single inexplicable fact: 0.75 tons. It was a phantom weight, a ghost in the machine. She began to notice other things, small cracks in the litany of daily life. The distribution of nutrient paste seemed slightly thinner. A minor shrine in an out-of-the-way corridor had its candle supply abruptly cut. It was as if the ship itself was undergoing a subtle, silent rationing, a tightening of belts no one would officially acknowledge. The breakthrough came from a source she had overlooked: the past. Buried in her data slate's archive was the original, centuries-old construction schematic of the St. Andronicus, a file included for historical reference in assessing structural wear. It was a labyrinthine document of incredible detail. Comparing it to the current, approved deck plan she used for her duties, she found a discrepancy. On the schematic, Deck Theta 7 showed a large, subdivided chamber directly adjacent to cargo port Theta 77, labeled secondary long-term stowage, classification, ecclesiastical auxiliary. On the current plan, that chamber did not exist. In its place was a crosshatch zone marked structural reinforcement, no access. A room had been erased from official memory. The wall she had stood before was not just a wall. It was a secret. Accessing that secret required a key she did not have. The door to the chamber, if it even was a door, would be sealed by mechanisms keyed to the ship security command or the ecclesiarchy's own sanctified codes. Her scribal clearance was a passkey to information, not to physical barriers. For days, she circled the problem, a prowling animal trapped outside a lit cage. She considered and dismissed a dozen reckless plans: forging a work order, attempting to hack a low-level servitor's directive protocols. Each was a path to a blinding cell in the brig, or a swift ejection from an airlock for heresy and corruption. The ship's justice was as efficient as its plumbing. The answer, in the end, was not digital but biological. It came in the form of a servitor designated D-77, a once-human thing now fused with a maintenance cart, its single arm ending in a complex multi-tool. Its duty was the lubrication of the deck's track runners. It moved on squealing wheels, its pale, vacuous face staring ahead from a nest of cables, a single red optic lens glowing dully. Yvain had passed it a dozen times in her explorations. It was part of the scenery, a piece of moving machinery no more notable than a coolant pipe. But she remembered the schematic. The maintenance access to the track runners ran behind the wall of the structural reinforcement zone. D-77's programming might grant an entry where hers would not. The currency of the lower decks was not coin, but utility. She observed D-77 for a full cycle, noting its route, its pauses. It stopped at a specific junction every 6 hours and 43 minutes for precisely 2 minutes, awaiting a clearance signal from a rusted wall-mounted sensor. During that pause, it was inert, its tools hanging limp. On its cart, among canisters of viscous lubricant, was a small, capped vial of sacred unction oil, used to anoint the track runner joints as a ritual of machine spirit appeasement. The oil was thin, amber, and precious. On her next visit, Yvain brought her own vial, a lesser-grade ink thinner she used to clean her stylus. As D-77 paused, she moved with a speed that surprised her. She uncapped the vial of sacred oil, poured its contents into a clean rag she had brought, and swiftly replaced it with her ink thinner, recapping it before the servitor's optic lens could swivel. The theft was breathtakingly small. A few milliliters of oil. 2 cycles later, she was waiting at the maintenance hatch that led into the track runner conduit. It was a small, round portal like the entrance to a pipe. D-77 approached on schedule, its arm extended, the multi-tool clicking and whirring. It presented a vial of sacred oil to a scanner beside the hatch. A green light flickered. With a hiss of pneumatics, the hatch irised open. The servitor began its laborious process of entering the tight space. This was her only chance. Heart hammering against her ribs, Yvain squeezed in behind the hulking metal cart, into the stifling, oil-stinking darkness of the conduit. Just as the hatch sealed shut behind them, the world became a tunnel of greasy metal, so narrow her shoulders brushed both sides. The only light came from D-77's single red optic, casting a hellish glow on the intricate forest of moving parts just inches above their heads. The track runners, massive conveyor chains that helped move cargo pods along the deck. The sound was a deafening, metallic cacophony of grinding, clattering, and shrieking that vibrated through her teeth. The servitor moved forward with mindless determination, stopping periodically to apply the false oil with a reverent, mechanical precision. Yvain crouched behind it, her robe snagging on protruding bolts, her lungs burning with a thick, aerosolized grease in the air. They traveled for what felt like an eternity in the claustrophobic dark. Then, D-77 halted before a heavy, horizontal grate. This was not a scheduled stop. Its head rotated slowly, the red lens scanning the grate. With a sudden, sharp motion of its tool arm, it punched a sequence of pressure points on the grate's frame. There was a dull clunk, and the entire section of grating swung inward, silent on well-oiled hinges. A stale, cold breath of air washed over Vane, carrying a scent utterly alien to the ship. The dry, sterile, faintly sweet odor of long-preserved organic matter, and beneath it, the sharp tang of failing stasis field generators. D-77 did not enter. It simply turned and began its journey back the way it had come, leaving her crouched in the dark before the open doorway. The servitor's programming, she realized with a jolt, had not been to let her in. It had been to perform maintenance on something inside. She was an accident, a parasite in its system. Swallowing hard, she crawled through the opening. She stood up into a vast, dark silence. The chamber was enormous, a cathedral of forgotten cargo. High above, dead lumens hung like fossilized fruit. The only illumination came from the faint, sickly green glow of power indicators on rows upon rows of upright, coffin-like units. They were arranged in grids, disappearing into the darkness. Stasis cradles. Ancient, simple in design, their surfaces etched with the Imperial Aquila and serial numbers she couldn't read from this distance. Her breath fogged in the suddenly cold air. She took a step forward, her boots scuffing on dust an inch thick. No one had been here for a very, very long time. Most of the cradles were dark, their indicator runes dead. Their frosted glass viewports were blank. But as she moved deeper into forest of silent machinery, she saw a cluster where the green light still glimmered, pulsing weakly like dying fireflies. She approached one, wiping the dust from its viewport with a trembling hand. The glass was cold. Inside, suspended in a hazy blue light, was a child. A girl, perhaps 8 or 9 standard years old. She wore a simple, gray smock. Her face was peaceful in sleep, her chest barely moving. She was perfectly ordinary. Not a mutant, not a psyker. No marks of corruption. Just a child. Yvain moved to the next live cradle. A boy, then another girl. She counted 12 in this cluster, all sleeping the same deep artificial sleep. The cradles were not labeled with names, only with long alphanumeric strings and a single, chilling designation, Astro's Project Quietude. Batch Theta 77. Viability nominal, asterisk. The meaning crashed down upon her, not with a scream, but with the quiet, suffocating weight of a world. The missing choir voice. The jettisoned pod. 0.75 tons. They weren't disposing of waste. They were culling the batch. A stasis cradle, with its occupant, had a mass of approximately 0.75 tons. When a cradle failed, or when its viability dropped, they jettisoned it into the warp. The choir's voice had vanished because its singer had been removed. This was not a secret hold of treasures or heretical artifacts. It was a tomb for the innocent, a quiet, organized disposal system hidden in the belly of a pilgrim ship. The Saint Andronicus didn't just carry the faithful to Terra. It carried this, and it was happening now, in the dark, to the sound of grinding machinery and whispered prayers. Time ceased its flow. Yvain stood in the dust-choked silence, her hand still pressed against the cold glass of the stasis cradle. The child's face, serene in its artificial sleep, was a mirror that showed her reflection the Imperium she had never dared to see. It was not the grand, Gothic edifice of faith and heroism from the sermons. It was this quiet, efficient, and utterly merciless. A machine that consumed its own future to fuel its present. Project Quietude. The name was a poison. It wasn't a project of salvation, but of silencing. What was their crime? Were they the children of psychers, deemed potentially dangerous? Orphans from a world deemed expendable? A genetic stockpile for some forgotten purpose? The reason didn't matter. The reality did. They were cargo, expendable cargo. The hum of the stasis fields was the only sound, a high-pitched whine that seemed to vibrate in her skull. She looked down the endless rows of dead cradles. Hundreds, perhaps thousands. How many voyages had this ship made? How many batches have been quietly terminated, ejected into the Imperium like so much toxic waste? Each one, a 0.75-ton secret. Each one, perhaps coinciding with a missing note in him, a voice in the choir that simply stopped. The liturgy of the ship was not just prayer. It was a cover for a slow, systematic murder. A rational part of her mind, the scribe part trained in self-preservation, screamed at her to leave, to crawl back to the conduit, to forget what she had seen, to bury the knowledge so deep it would fossilize. She could go back to her alcove, to her logs of piety markers, and live. But as she looked at the sleeping girl, she knew that option had evaporated. To know this and do nothing was to become complicit. It was to become part of the machine's silent, grinding gear work. The cold in the room seeped through her robes and into her bones. She made a decision not from courage, but from a desperate, instinctive need to bear witness. She fumbled for her data slate, her fingers numb. She activated its low-light pick capture function, a tool for documenting damage manifests. The green glow from the cradle indicators provided just enough light. She took an image of the child in the cradle. She took an image of the designation plate. Project Quietude. She took wider shots of the forest of dead units. The slate's memory was limited, but she filled it with fragments of the tomb. It was evidence. Flimsy, heretical evidence that would see her executed. But it was something, a record that this place and these children had existed. As she worked, a new sound intruded on the hum. A soft, rhythmic click-clack, like delicate metal on stone. It was coming from the far end of the chamber, from the deepest darkness. She froze, her blood turning to ice. She wasn't alone. The click-clack moved slowly, deliberately. It was not the heavy tread of security, nor the squealing roll of a servitor cart. This was something else. She shrank back behind a row of cradles, extinguishing her slate's glow, pressing herself into the dust and shadow. The sound grew closer, a shape resolved from the gloom. It was a custodian guard, not a statue from the pages of devotional text, but living, breathing, and here. His armor was burnished gold, but it was devoid of the brilliant sheen she imagined. Here in the dust, it was a deep, somber hue, etched with microscopic scars of service. A deep red plume flowed from his crested helm. In one hand, he held a massive guardian spear, its blade dormant. The other hand was empty. He moved with a predator's grace that was utterly silent save for the soft click of his armored soles on the deck. He was not patrolling. He was observing. He stopped before the cluster of active cradles, his helmeted gaze seeming to pass over each sleeping child. He stood there for a long moment, a golden sentinel in a garden of ghosts. Then he turned his head, not towards her hiding place, but upwards, as if listening to something only he could hear. A faint, subvocal click came from his helm's vox grill, a communication. To whom? He then did something that shattered Yvain's understanding even further. He reached out with his empty hand and placed it, not on the cradle, but in the air beside it, palm flat. A gesture that could have been a blessing or a shield. A soft, golden nimbus, faint as a candle flame at dawn, emanated from his palm, washing over cradles. The weak green indicator lights seemed to steady, their pulse growing slightly stronger for a few seconds before fading back to their previous frail state. He was not here to destroy the evidence. He was tending to it, preserving it. This secret was known and was being kept by one of the Emperor's own personal guardians. The horror deepened, becoming infinitely more complex. This was not a rogue operation. This was sanctioned, protected. The custodian lowered his hand. The light died. He stood for another moment of perfect stillness. then turned and began to walk away, his click-clack footsteps fading back into the darkness from which he came. Yvain remained frozen long after the sound had vanished, her mind a white noise of terror and awe. She had come looking for a crime and found a ritual, a silent, grim ritual of preservation maintained by a demigod. What did it mean? Why were they here? Who were they for? The questions were vortices, threatening to pull her apart. With trembling limbs, she crawled back to the maintenance grate, back into the clattering, greasy hell of the conduit, carrying with her not just the images on her slate, but the searing afterimage of that golden giant standing vigil in the dark. The return journey was a blur of panic and grease. She emerged from the conduit hatch like a creature birthed from the ship's intestines, her robe stained, her skin smeared with black lubricant. She half ran, half stumbled to the deserted lower deck corridors, expecting at any moment to feel the crushing grip of a golden gauntlet on her shoulder, or the crackle of a security shock maul. Neither came. The Saint Andronicus absorbed her back into its routine indifference. The lumens flickered, the plasma heart thrummed. Pilgrim shuffled past her, their eyes glazed, seeing only another filthy scribe. The normalcy was the most terrifying thing of all. She scrubbed the grime from her hands and face in the communal sanatorium, the water running gray. The evidence in her data slate felt like a live thermite charge. She needed to hide it, but there was no safe place. Her alcove could be searched. Her person could be scanned. In the end, she did the only thing that made a twisted sense. She uploaded the pic captures into the ship's central administrative data archive, buried within a nested folder of 5-year-old, pre-audited pilgrimage-tied records from the agri-world of Septimus Prime. It was a vast, ignored digital wasteland. She encrypted the folder with a simple cipher based on the missing choir notes timestamp. It was a fragile hiding place, but it was off her person. The knowledge, however, was a stain she couldn't scrub clean. It sat behind her eyes. The sleeping children, the golden guardian. 4-2 cycles. She moved through her duties like a servitor whose programming was glitching. She jumped at sudden noises. She avoided eye contact with everyone, especially the rare sight of a ship security officer. She expected discovery, retribution, but the ship continued its silent swim. The choir sang -1 voice. The preachers preached. It was as if the chamber and its contents existed on a separate plane, untouched by the daily life of the vessel. This, she realized, was the true power of the Imperium, not the ability to commit atrocity, but the ability to compartmentalize it so completely that it became invisible, even to those living directly above it. The summons, when it came, was not from security. It arrived as a soft chime from a data terminal she was passing. A plain text message flashed on the screen, devoid of official seals or identifiers. Scribe Yvain. Report to Novice Sanctorum Observation Gallery Beta. Authorization. Navigator Primera Zarental. Immediate. Her stomach dropped through the deck. The Navigator. The being whose third, I peered directly into the warp. The master of the ship's course through hell. He was not of the ecclesiarchy, not of the Administratum. He was a law unto himself, a mutant aristocrat whose family's curse was the Empire's salvation. How could he know? What could he possibly want? The Custodian's silent vigil had been terrifying in its majesty. The Navigator's gaze promised a different kind of terror, one that saw not just actions but the soul. There was no refusing. To ignore a Navigator's summons was a death sentence. With legs of lead, she began the ascent to the ship's apex. To the rarefied air where the reality of the warp was not a distant threat, but a constant, screaming companion. The pilgrim decks fell away, replaced by corridors that were wider, cleaner, their walls adorned not with grimacing saint carvings, but with abstract mosaics of colored crystal that seemed to shift and swim in peripheral vision. The air changed. The recycled staleness was scented now with faint, exotic incense, ambergris and void lotus, and beneath it a sharp, ozone tang that prickled the nostrils. It was a smell of active psi-tech, of contained psychic power. The silence here was profound, not the quiet of fear, but the hush of immense, concentrated will. Yvain passed no one. Occasional servitors, their forms sleek and plated in polished bronze, stood immobile in alcoves, their optics tracking her with silent, unnerving precision. A set of doors, carved from a single piece of deep violet when laid with silver astropathic sigils, barred her way. As she approached, they sighed open without a sound, revealing a short antechamber. A figure waited there, not a servitor, but a human retainer dressed in robes of midnight blue, his face pale and drawn, a filigreed neural shunt gleaming at his temple. He did not speak. He merely gestured with a white-gloved hand toward a final, circular portal of bronze metal. It irised open, and a wave of thick, chemically warm air washed over her, carrying the cloying scent of narcotic vapors and something else, a psychic pressure, like the static charge before a storm. The novice sanctorum was not a bridge, as she understood it. It was a spherical chamber, its curved walls a single, vast armor-glass viewport. Outside, the warp raged in a silent, breathtaking cataclysm of impossible colors. Violet storms bleeding into emerald whirlpools, continents of bruised indigo bruising against tides of screaming crimson. It was beautiful and revolting. In the center of the chamber, suspended on a platform connected by a narrow walkway, was the Navigator's throne. It was a nest of brass pipes, crystal lenses, and humming energy fields. And within it sat Lord Navigator Zorenthal. He was both more and less than human. His body was swathed in sumptuous robes of black and gold, but it seemed shrunken, frail. His face was long and aristocratic, pale as a corpse, framed by lank white hair. But it was his forehead that commanded horror and awe. Where a third eye should have been, there was a swirling, pulsing vortex of light, sealed behind a crystal lens set into his flesh. It was not an eye that saw light, but one that saw the currents, the storms, the predators, and the memories of the Immaterium. His two natural eyes were closed, as if in permanent respite from the vision his warp sight forced upon him. "Come forward, scribe." The voice was dry, parchment thin, yet it carried an immense, weary weight. It seemed to come not just from him, but from the very air of the chamber, vibrating in her teeth. Yvain forced her feet to move, stepping onto the narrow walkway over a dizzying drop to the lower section of the sphere. She stopped a respectful distance from the throne, her head bowed. "You have seen the quiet place," Zorenthal stated. It was not a question. His warp eye pulsed, its light washing over her, and she felt a terrible, intrusive sensation, as if her recent memories were being skimmed like stones across the surface of his consciousness. "My lord, she began, but had no words for denial. He knew. "Do not fear my judgment, child. I did not bring you here to punish curiosity." He paused, and his closed, natural eyes twitched, as if watching a painful dream. "I brought you here because you have seen, and because you have felt the dissonance, the silence where a note should be." His warp eyes swiveled, not to look at her, but to gaze out into the maelstrom. "They tell you we navigators steer by the light of the Astronomican. This is a simplification. We also steer by the silence, by the absences. The warp is not empty. It is a sea of thought, of emotion, of memory. The screams of demons are loud, but louder still, to an eye like mine, are the places where the screaming stops, where there is only a profound, echoing quiet." He shifted in his throne, the movement causing a cascade of soft clicks from the life support apparatus around him. "This region of our passage, it is a quiet place, not silent, quiet. The predators here do not swarm. They skirt the edges. They are apprehensive, for in this silence there is a memory, a cold, sad, reaching memory." He finally turned his warp eye fully upon her. The light was not blinding, but deep, a window into an infinite, melancholy night. "You saw the children. You think they are cargo, a commodity. You are wrong. They are an anchor." Yvain's mind reeled. An anchor? The word clashed violently with the image of the silent, sleeping forms. An anchor was heavy, solid, meant to hold something fast against the current. These children were the opposite. Fragile, passive, discarded. "The warp," Zorenthal continued, his voice a low monotone against the silent scream of the vista behind him, "does not forget what the material universe seeks to erase. A life cast into its depths does not merely vanish. It leaves a resonance, a psychic echo, especially a life cut short, a potential unfulfilled. Multiply that echo by hundreds, by thousands. over centuries of voyages. His warp eye pulsed, its light dimming for a moment, as if overwhelmed. What you have discovered is not a prison, scribe. It is a damping field, a psychic sink. The concept was too vast, too alien. She struggled to grasp it. They absorb something? Not absorb. They quiet. The sorrow, the fear, the sheer psychic weight of their suspended animation. It creates a field of profound negation, a dead zone in the Imperium. My third eye does not see demons clawing at our Geller field here. It sees them avoiding us, circling at a distance. They are repelled not by light, but by this specific, concentrated echo of innocent loss. It is a candle that burns with cold flame, and the things of flame do not understand it. They fear it. The horrific practicality of it dawned on her, more chilling than any tale of possession. The Imperium was using these children, their very existence and their scheduled, silent deaths, as a shield. A bulwark made not of faith or plasteel, but of sacrificed futures. The Custodian's Vigil wasn't just preservation. It was maintenance of a piece of critical, macabre warp drive technology. Project Quietude. The name was not a descriptor. It was an instruction manual. The choir, Yvain whispered, the connection slotting into place with a sickening finality. Zorenthal gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. Each child is psychically attuned in a subtle, latent way. Their vital signs, their simple brainwave patterns, are woven into the ship's devotional harmonic matrix. The choir. It is a feedback loop. The choir's song helps stabilize their stasis, and their collective, quiet presence stabilizes our passage. When one fails, when the echo winks out, the harmonic falters, the note vanishes, the balance is disturbed. And so, the failed unit must be removed to prevent a cascade failure of the field. He said the last word with profound distaste. It is a grim calculus, a sin against tomorrow to protect the damned today. He looked away from her, back into the warp. You wonder why I tell you this. It is because the quiet is changing. The echo is deepening. It is no longer just an absence. It is becoming a presence. My sees shapes in the silence now. Not demons. Smaller shapes. Quiet shapes. They gather in our wake, following the trail of tears we have shed into the void. He turned his frail head toward her, his natural eyes still shut tight against a reality he could no longer bear. The past is not dead, scribe. It is not even past. It is following us, and I do not know if it seeks to be remembered or to be reclaimed. The weight of his confession pressed the air from the room. Yvain stood on the narrow walkway, the silent fury of the warp on one side, the shrunken confessor of horrors on the other. The universe had inverted itself. Demons were to be feared, but they were a known quantity, an enemy you could hate. This was a tragedy so vast and institutionalized had been turned into a utility. The children were not victims of a monster. They were a component in a machine. And the machine was breaking in a way even its operators didn't understand. What happened? She asked, her voice barely escaping the thick air. When we reached Terra, Zorenthal's warp eye flickered, a spasm of ugly color. The project parameters are for transit. The field is a navigational aid, a protective shroud for the journey. Upon safe translation to real space within the Sol system, the remaining viable units. He paused, and for the first time his parchment voice cracked with something like emotion. Are processed. The anchor is lifted. The quiet ends. Processed. The bureaucratic term hung in the narcotic haze, more terrible than any scream. It meant the hold would be emptied. The sleeping would be terminated. The shield, having served its purpose, would be dismantled. The knowledge felt like a physical blow. She had stumbled upon a slow-motion massacre already in progress, with a scheduled, efficient conclusion. You cannot stop it, Zorenthal said, as if reading the rebellion forming in her silence. I cannot stop it. The orders are sealed with the sigils of the highest echelons of the Administratum and the Paternova of my own house. The Custodian you saw guards the process, not the children. He ensures the sanctity of the Emperor's will as it has been interpreted by his servants. He leaned forward, a faint strain showing in his neck. But you have seen, you feel the dissonance. The warp feels it too, and it is responding. I have navigated the tides of madness for 147 years. I have seen the faces of gods and the birth screams of hells. But this quiet gathering in our wake, it is new. A soft chime echoed through the sanctum. Zarenthal's head tilted, listening to a suboral signal. Our translation window approaches. You must return to your duties. He seemed to diminish further into his throne, the energy of his revelation spent. Remember this, scribe. The greatest horrors are not those that rage against the light. They are those performed in silence, in the name of the light. You now hold a shard of that silence. What you do with it, that will define what kind of echo you leave in this world. The mute retainer reappeared at the chamber's entrance. The audience was over. Yvain was led back through the silent, shimmering corridors, descending from the rarefied atmosphere of cosmic dread back in the familiar, grinding dread of the common decks. But nothing was familiar anymore. The prayers from a nearby chapel sounded hollow, a cover for the silent machinery below. The worried faces of pilgrims seemed naive. They feared the warp outside. They had no idea the true engine of their safety or its cost. She was drowning in the knowledge, and Zarenthal had given her no lifeline, only the certainty of the coming storm. The past was following them, and it was getting closer. The final cycles before translation were a study in amplified anxiety. The normal tension of impending real space return was now laced for Yvain, with a crushing sense of doomed countdown. Every routine announcement from the ship security vox felt like a prelude to the final, grim order for Deck Theta 7. Every hymn from the choir was a dirge for the silent sleepers below. She tried to focus on her work, the lines of data on her slate swimming before her eyes. She had become a ghost haunting her own life, moving through the rituals of survival while her mind screamed in the quiet chamber. She began to notice the subtle signs Zarenthal had spoken of, or perhaps she was now primed to see them. It was in the behavior of the few sanctioned psychers aboard, the astropath and his attendants. They became increasingly agitated, clutching their heads during prayers, speaking of cold spots in the Imperium in a silent choir that drowned out the distant melodies of the Astronomican. The ship's preachers denounced this as weakness of faith, a failure to shield one's soul. But Yvain knew better. They were sensing the gathering resonance. The echo was becoming a signal. On the last cycle, during a mandatory devotion in the main chapel, the event occurred. The preacher was in full thunder, describing the glorious sight of the solar system's defenses, the majesty of Holy Terra. The choir was building to a crescendo, and then every lumen in the chapel died. Not a flicker, not a dimming, a total, absolute blackout, so profound it felt like being swallowed. A collective gasp sucked the oxygen from the room. Then, in the darkness, a sound, not from a vox, not from any human throat. It was a whisper that seemed to come from the walls themselves, from the cold deck beneath their knees. It was not one voice, but 1,000, 10,000, layered into a single, rustling sigh. It contained no words, only a profound, desolate recognition. It was a sound of forgotten things remembering they had been loved. It lasted 3 seconds. The lumens flared back to life, brighter than before. The preacher, pale and sweating, declared it a test of faith, a final assault by the forces of the warp before they escaped its clutches. The pilgrims wept and prayed louder. But the terror on the faces of security officers lining the walls was not theological. It was the terror of men who had just heard the plumbing in the walls speak. Yvain sat frozen, her hands ice cold. That had not been an attack. It had been a greeting. The ship-wide vox crackled with the sharp, authoritative voice of the captain. All hands, prepare for translation to real space. All hands to designated secure stations. Emperor, protect us. The final ritual had begun. The great plasma heart of the St. Andronicus began to change its rhythm, the steady thrum-thrum-thrum speeding into a pained, straining whine. The Geller field generators protested, a rising shriek that vibrated in the teeth. Yvain, along with the other scribes, was herded into their fortified work chamber, the heavy blast doors sealing with a final, booming clang. They were in the belly of the beast as it prepared to vomit them back into reality. Through the reinforced viewport in the door, she saw a crew raiding sprinting past, Armed security teams doubled timing it towards the lower decks, not to defend against boarders, to oversee the processing. The anchor was being lifted. Zarenthal's words echoed. They are processed. The quiet ends. Her hand went to the data slate at her belt, the one that held the cipher to the hidden folder. She had evidence. Proof of Project Quietude of the children of the systematic disposal. To release it would be an act of catastrophic heresy. She would be executed. The Navigator would likely be purged. The Custodian's role would be investigated by powers that made the notion of justice a mockery. The ship might be scuttled as tainted, and the children would still be processed. Her truth would not save them. It would only add more bodies to the pyre, more echoes to the silent choir. Yet, to do nothing was to become the silence. To seal the horror behind a blast door compliance. To let the machine consume its designated fuel and continue, unchallenged, on to the next voyage and the next. The war within her was a microcosm of the Imperium itself. The desperate need for survival at any cost. Crashing against a shattered fragment of a conscience it claimed no longer existed. The ship shuddered violently, a scream of tormented metal. The warp was relinquishing its grip. On the view screen linked to the ship's external augers, the insane kaleidoscope of the Imperium began to shred, peeling away like rotten skin to reveal the clean, hard, black velvet of real space, pinpricked with the steady, distant light of stars. And there, ahead, a faint, glorious, golden pinprick, growing slowly brighter. The Astronomican, Holy Terra, salvation for those who deserved it. As the ship stabilized, the internal vox announced in a flat, mechanical tone, "Translation complete. All security protocols for Deck Data 7 are now in effect. Stand by for system ingress." The processing had begun. Yvain looked at her trembling hands, then at the sealed door. The choice was upon her. To scream the truth into a universe that would punish her for it, or to swallow the silence and let it become a part of her, a new, cold component in the machine. Outside the viewport, in the pristine silence of the void, she wondered if the small, quiet shapes the Navigator saw were still there, watching, waiting to see what the living would do with the memory of the lost. The silence in the scribe chamber was absolute, not the quiet of relief, but the held breath pause before an execution. Yvain could feel the ship turning, its colossal engines firing with a new, purposeful rhythm, aligning for the final, sacred approach to the throne world. They were back in the cold, rational embrace of reality. The nightmare of the warp was over. The other nightmare, the one made of cold metal and colder decisions, was entering its final, administrative phase. She could almost hear it, beneath the thrum of the engines. The hiss of stasis fields disengaging, the soft, final chimes of life support monitors flatlining, the methodical footsteps of the security details. Processing. Her data slate felt like a lodestone, its hidden contents pulling her towards an abyss. To act was futile. To not act was damnation. The preacher spoke of damnation as fire and torment. This was different. It was the damnation of knowing and choosing to lie. It was the slow death of the self, replaced by the efficient, unfeeling function of the cog. She thought of the Custodian's golden, silent vigil. Was that his fate? To bear witness to eternity, to atrocities, not to prevent them, but to ensure their flawless execution? To become not a hero, but a glorified quality control monitor for hell? An idea, terrible and fragile, sparked in the darkness of her resignation. It was not a plan to save the children. That was impossible. The machinery was too vast, too sanctioned. It was a plan to deny the machine one thing: its silence. The Imperium thrived on forgetting. It buried its sins in red tape and ritual, in the deep holes of pilgrim ships and the classified archives of the Administratum. What if this one sin was not allowed to be forgotten? Not as a scream of heresy, but as a whisper of data, a ghost in the system. She waited for a moment of distraction. A junior scribe dropping a stack of data slates. The senior scribe barking correction. In that second of clatter and raised voices, her fingers flew over her slate. She did not access the hidden folder. Instead, she opened a ship-wide devotional bulletin, a constantly updating scroll of pious messages, Saint Day notices, and morale-building missives that flickered on public terminals in every common area. using an old, all-but-forgotten subroutine she'd once used to correct a bulletin typo. She embedded a string of code. It was not a message. It was a key, the cipher to unlock the hidden folder. She said to trigger not now, but upon the St. Andronicus's next system entry, its next warp translation. It would be a time release, a data phantom set to haunt the ship's own informational bloodstream on its next journey. She then input a single clear command into the archival system housing the hidden folder. Upon release of the cipher, duplicate the contents. Send one copy to the isolated long-term storage of the ship's own logistical core, a place for records meant to endure for millennia, rarely accessed. Send another, not to any external source, but to the private, encrypted manuscript library of the Navigator's sanctum, addressed to Zorental's personal retinue. A final record, for the one being aboard who understood the cost, and who might, in some future, whisper to another who needed to hear. It was not justice. It was not salvation. It was a message in a bottle, thrown into the ship's own endless, looping voyage. A scar on the data core. A single, documented grain of truth in the mountain of sanctioned lies. When the next scribe, 10 or 100 years from now, went digging for anomalies, they might find it. When Zorental's successor felt the quiet gathering and searched his own archives for precedent, he might find it. The truth would not die with her. It would be entombed within the very system that sought to erase it, a silent passenger on all future voyages. The chamber's main door hissed open. A security officer, his face grim, stood framed in the doorway. Scribe Yvain, by order of the ship's confessor and the captain's authority, you are to come with us for debriefing. They knew. Perhaps they had tracked her access logs, or the Navigator's retinue had reported her distress. It didn't matter. She stood, her legs steady for the first time in days. She placed her official data slate on the workbench. As she was let out, she took one last look at the common deck through a nearby viewport. Pilgrims were pressed against the glass, weeping with joy at the sight of the distant, gleaming Holy Terra. They saw a promise fulfilled. She saw the glittering pinnacle of the machine that had just quietly consumed its sacrifice to fuel this moment of triumph. The golden light of the Astronomican, the Emperor's own will, shone down upon them all. It illuminated the faithful. It illuminated the guilty. And somewhere in the deep, dark hold of the ship, it illuminated rows of empty, silent cradles being cleaned by mindless servitors, ready for the next batch, the next voyage, the next necessary quiet sin. She walked with her escorts, not toward the cell, but towards an unknown fate. Behind her, in the ship's data core, a silent clock began to count down. The past was not dead. She had just given a voice and said to speak on a delay. The warp remembers. And now, in a small, terrible way, the ship would remember too.